They ask me why I did it. Journalists mostly. The odd historian. A woman once stopped me outside a chemist in Kelsbridge and asked if I was him, and when I said yes, she started crying, right there, with a bag of oranges in her hand. But nobody ever asks the right question. They ask why I broke ranks, why I spoke, why a man in the Aldermere household guard, a man trained since 19 to stand like furniture, to bleed quietly if he had to, opened his mouth on the day we buried Queen Ottoline. Nobody asks what I heard. That's the whole thing, you see. That's the entire matter. Everything else, the discipline board, the papers, the 4 days I spent in a room with men who outranked me by a mile and wanted me gone, all of it turns on 11 seconds of sound. I'm going to tell you what I heard. And then you can decide for yourself whether I broke protocol, or whether protocol broke first, and I was only the man standing close enough to notice. My name is Elias Rooke. I was a corporal in the 3rd Company, Household Guard, Kingdom of Aldermere. 11 years' service by the time of the funeral. My father had done 19. His father had done 23 and lost 2 fingers to frostbite doing it, standing a winter post at Vantry Gate the year the pipes froze and the palace forgot the guardhouse existed. We are not a glamorous family. We stand where we're told and we do not move. That's the job. People think it's ceremony. It's not. It's endurance. It's your knees going to water in the 3rd hour and your eyes locked on a point 400 feet away and a fly walking across your upper lip, and you do nothing, you are nothing. You are a red coat and a straight spine and a rifle, and the whole point of you is that you do not react. 11 years I did not react. Then I heard 11 seconds, and I reacted, and that was the end of my career and the beginning of whatever this has been since. Let me set it out properly. The day, the weather, all of it, because the small things matter and the papers never got them right. Queen Ottoline died on a Tuesday in late October. She was 91. She'd been Queen of Aldermere for 63 years, which meant that almost nobody alive could remember a time before her. My grandfather had guarded her coronation. My father had guarded her jubilee. And I stood the outer cordon at her funeral, which is a thing I still can't quite fit into my head some nights. 3 generations of Rookes, standing still for the same woman. The funeral was held on the 9th of November. Cold. Not the sharp, bright cold you get in December, the other kind. Gray and wet and low, the sky sitting down on the rooftops like something tired. It had rained through the night and stopped around 5 in the morning, and the streets had that black mirror shine to them, and the whole city smelled like wet stone and diesel and the flowers. God, the flowers. You have to understand what the flowers were like. People had been leaving them for a week. Outside Cardron Palace, along the Queen's Mile, banked up against the railings 6 feet deep in places. Wrapped in cellophane, most of them, and the cellophane caught the light and made this constant low crackle when the wind moved, like something breathing. And underneath the fresh ones, the older ones had started to rot. So the smell was 2 smells at once, the sweet green top note, and then the sour brown thing underneath it. That's what a nation's grief smells like, as it turns out, sweet on top, rotting underneath. I've never been able to unsmell it. I was posted on the north approach of St. Aldwyn's, the cathedral, at the base of the processional steps, not inside. Inside was for the Life Company, the tall lads, the ones who look good in photographs. I was outer cordon, which meant I was one of the men holding the line between the mourners and the route. My position was, and I want to be precise about this, because it matters, approximately 11 feet from the point where the royal family would dismount their vehicles and begin the ascent to the cathedral doors. 11 feet, that is not a long way. That is close enough to hear a woman breathe. We formed up at 0640. The service was at 11. That's 4 hours and 20 minutes of standing before a single member of the family arrived. And I want you to sit with that number for a moment, because everybody focuses on what happened at 11 o'clock and nobody thinks about the 4 hours before it. 4 hours and 20 minutes. Standing. In the cold, with the wet coming up through the boots and the crowd building and building behind the barriers until you could feel the pressure of them, the weight of 40,000 people not making a sound. That's the part nobody believes. The silence, 40,000 people and you could hear a pigeon land. Occasionally somebody would start crying and you'd hear it travel, this little wave of noise moving through the crowd, a sob, then a shush, then nothing. And then a minute later, somewhere else, another one, like something popping in a fire. By 9 o'clock my hands had gone, completely gone. The gloves are white leather and they are worth precisely nothing against a November morning. You get to a point where your fingers stop reporting in. They just go quiet. By 10 I couldn't feel my feet either, and that's when the trick starts. The thing they teach you at Harrogate, the thing every guardsman learns in the first year or washes out. You take your mind out. You put it somewhere else, and you leave the body standing there like a coat on a hook. I used to go to my grandfather's allotment. Don't laugh. 11 years of ceremonial duty, and where I went in my head was a patch of dirt in Kelsbridge with a broken greenhouse and a rhubarb bed. I'd go there and I'd weed it, row by row, slowly, and I could stand for 6 hours doing that. I was in the rhubarb when the cars came. I heard them before I saw them. The engines, Aldermere state vehicles, have a particular note, a low, even hum, deliberately quiet, and then the sound of the crowd changing. That's a thing I can't describe well. When 40,000 silent people become 40,000 more silent people, there's a sort of intake, a tightening. I came back into my body, straightened the spine that was already straight, locked my eyes forward. And the family came up the approach. King Aubryn first, Ottoline's son, 68 years old, and he looked 90 that morning, gray, hollow, moving like a man wadding. He had his hand on the arm of Queen Consort Vesper, and I remember thinking it wasn't clear who was holding up whom. Then Prince Cassian, the heir, his wife Princess Delphine, and behind them the children. There were 3 of them, 2 boys and a girl. The girl was Princess Marin. She was 9 years old. I'd seen her before. Guardsmen do, we're scenery, and children don't understand that scenery has eyes. I'd stood at Vantry Gate the summer before and watched her chase a dog across the south lawn for 20 minutes, absolutely shrieking with laughter, and I had not moved a muscle and had wanted very badly to laugh. She was a loud child, is what I'm saying, full of it, the kind of 9-year-old who can't walk somewhere if running is an option. That morning she came up the approach in a black coat, holding her mother's hand, and she was so quiet and so small and so careful that for a second I didn't recognize her. She was crying. Not loudly. That's what got me. She was crying the way a child cries when they have been told kindly, gently by someone who loves them that today they must not cry. Her chin was doing this thing, this awful little tremble, and she kept sucking her breath in through her nose sharp, trying to hold it, and every few steps her shoulders would jump. She was trying so hard. 9 years old, and she was trying so hard to be good at her grandmother's funeral. The party stopped at the base of the steps. There's a pause built into the choreography. The coffin is being brought up behind, and the family must wait to fall in behind it. 30 seconds, perhaps 40. It's the only unscripted air in the entire day. They stopped 11 feet from me. And Princess Marin, standing there in the cold with the flashbulbs going off like a slow-motion lightning storm, finally lost it. Just a little, just for a moment. She made a sound, a small wet hiccuping sound, and put both hands over her face, and her mother crouched down instantly, right there in the street, and pulled her in. Delphine crouched in the road in a black coat in front of the World's Press, and held her daughter's head against her shoulder. I want that on the record. I want somebody to write down that the Princess of Aldermere knelt in a wet street and did not care who saw her do it. And then I heard it. Queen Consort Vesper was standing perhaps 4 feet to my right and slightly forward. Her back was to me. She was speaking to a woman I later learned was her private secretary, a Mrs. Ansell, and they had their heads inclined together the way people do when they're saying something not meant to travel. But sound travels strangely on wet stone between buildings in a silence like that. It travels straight to a man standing 11 feet away, who has spent 11 years learning to notice everything and respond to nothing. I heard her say, and I have never once in 11 years since changed a single word of this. Not for the board, not for the lawyers, not for the papers. Oh, for God's sake. Then a breath, a short one, almost a laugh. She's not even sad, she's performing. She's been coached, look at her, she's timing it for the cameras. 9 years old and already a little actress. Ottoline would have been appalled. And then Mrs. Ansell made a sound. A small, uncomfortable please don't sound. And Vesper laughed. Not loud, not cruel sounding even. That's the thing that still turns my stomach. It wasn't a wicked cackle. It was worse than that. It was light. It was the little amused exhale of a woman who has said something she thinks is clever at a party about someone she finds tiresome. She laughed at a 9-year-old crying for her grandmother. 11 feet from me. 11 seconds. Here is what I want you to understand about the next part. The training is not a suggestion. It is not a strong recommendation. It is the entire architecture of what a household guardsman is. You do not move. You do not speak. You do not turn your head. Members of the public have thrown drinks at us, screamed abuse. A man once punched a guardsman I served with in the mouth at Vantry Gate, and that guardsman stood there with blood running down his chin and did not so much as blink until the police took the fellow away. You do not react. I had been that man for 11 years. My father had been that man for 19. My grandfather had stood in a frozen guardhouse until his fingers went black rather than break his post. I understood exactly what I was. And I felt something go through me that morning that I have never felt before or since. It came up from somewhere underneath the cold, underneath the 4 hours of standing, underneath the rhubarb and the allotment and the whole careful apparatus I'd built to keep myself absent. And it was not anger, exactly. It was recognition. Because I knew that laugh. Every man from Kelsbridge knows that laugh. It's the laugh of people who have decided in advance that your grief is a performance, your pain is a scheme, your tears are a tactic. It's the laugh that gets used on a widow at a benefits tribunal, on a boy in a headmaster's office, on anyone small who has the poor taste to be visibly hurt in front of someone powerful. I had heard that laugh my entire life. I had just never heard it aimed at a child in a black coat with her face in her mother's shoulder. I turned my head. That's all. Understand me, that's all I did at first. A guardsman turning his head at a state funeral is, in the language of my regiment, roughly equivalent to a man setting himself on fire in a cathedral. It is enormous. There were 3 men in my line who saw me do it, and one of them told me afterwards that his stomach dropped through the floor. I turned my head, and I looked at the back of the Queen Consort's neck. And she must have felt it, because she turned too. She was 59, handsome in the way that money makes people handsome, pale gray eyes, very calm. She looked at me the way you look at a chair that's made a noise. And then, this is the part I've never been able to explain properly, something in her face adjusted. Because she realized. She saw me looking, and she did the arithmetic, and she understood in about a quarter of a second that I had heard every word. I watched it land. I watched the calm come off her like a sheet coming off furniture. For one moment, one single moment, the Queen Consort of Aldermere looked frightened of a corporal. And then she got angry. She lifted her chin very slightly and she said, low and clear, "Eyes forward, guardsman." And that right there is where I could have stopped. I want to be honest about this, because I have had 11 years to be honest about it, and I've made a poor job of it up to now. I could have stopped. I could have snapped my eyes front and gone back to the rhubarb and let the whole thing wash off me the way I'd let 1,000 things wash off me, and nobody would ever have known, and I would have finished my 20 years and taken my pension and been a man who once stood near something and said nothing. That was available to me, that was right there. And I stood in the cold, 11 feet from a crying child, with my hands gone numb inside my white gloves and my grandfather's frostbitten fingers somewhere in the back of my skull. And I thought, no, not this one. I'll stand for anything. I'll stand for 6 hours in the rain. I'll stand while a drunk spits in my face. I'll stand until my knees give out and my hands turn black. But I will not stand here and let that go. I looked at her for one more second. And then I did the thing. I did not shout. The papers said I shouted. I did not shout. There were 40,000 people 50 yards away and a coffin coming up the road behind me, and I would not have raised my voice at Queen Ottoline's funeral for anything on this earth. I spoke. Quietly. Just loud enough to cross 4 feet of cold air. Just loud enough for her and for Mrs. Ansell, and, as it turned out, and as I did not intend, and as I have thought about every single day since, just loud enough for a 9-year-old girl standing 11 feet away with her face coming up out of her mother's shoulder. I said, "Ma'am, she's 9. And the world stopped. You have to imagine the geometry of it. 40,000 people, the world's cameras, a dead queen being carried up a wet road, and in the middle of all of it, this little pocket of absolute stillness, 5 or 6 people who had just heard a guardsman speak." Mrs. Ansell's hand came up to her mouth. Vesper's face went white and then red, in that order, very fast. And Princess Marin, God help me. Princess Marin lifted her head off her mother's shoulder and turned around and looked at me with her eyes swollen and her nose running and her whole small face confused, because she had heard her own age said out loud by a soldier, and she did not understand why. I have thought about that look for 11 years. I still don't know if I did her a kindness or a cruelty. Vesper said, "How dare you?" She said it through her teeth. She had gone entirely rigid. And I found that I was not finished. That's the thing nobody understands about a man like me breaking. It doesn't come out as rage. 11 years of not reacting doesn't turn into shouting. It turns into something much colder and much more articulate, because it's been sitting in the dark getting organized. I said, and I did not take my eyes off her, "You said she was performing, ma'am. You said she was timing it for the cameras." Vesper's mouth opened. I said, "She's not performing. I've watched that child chase a dog across a lawn for 20 minutes because she couldn't be bothered to walk. She's the loudest child in that palace. And she has been silent since 6:30 this morning because somebody told her she had to be, and she's been doing it, ma'am. She's been doing it beautifully. She's 9 years old and she's held it together for 4.5 hours in the cold, which is more than I've seen grown men manage." And then I said the thing that ended me. I said, "And you laughed at her." Behind me somewhere, a horse shifted its feet on the stone. King Aubryn had turned around. I hadn't seen him turn. I don't know when he turned, but I became aware, in the way you become aware of weather, that the King of Aldermere was standing 8 feet away looking directly at me, and that his face was doing something complicated. Prince Cassian had turned too, and Princess Delphine, still half-crouched, one hand on her daughter's back, staring up at me with an expression I have never in my life been able to name. 5 members of the royal family, looking at a corporal. And behind them, coming up the road with a slowness that made the whole thing worse, the coffin. Queen Ottoline. 8 guardsmen carrying her, and they had not stopped, because they had not broken, because they were doing their jobs, and I could see the strain in the neck of the man on the near left corner, and I knew him. His name was Peveril, and I had shared a room with him at Harrogate for 8 months. He looked at me over the coffin of the Queen, and his eyes said, very clearly, "Elias, what have you done?" Vesper found her voice. "Have that man removed," she said, "immediately." And nobody moved. That's the part that people don't believe. I've told this story in front of people who have said flatly that I've embroidered it. I have not embroidered it. The Queen Consort of Aldermere gave an order in a public street, and nobody moved. Not the two officers at the head of my line who had absolutely heard her and who I could see in my peripheral vision and who had gone completely still. Not the palace security men behind her. Not Mrs. Ansell. Nobody. There was a silence that lasted, I don't know, 3 seconds, 4. It was the longest 4 seconds of my life. And then a 9-year-old girl let go of her mother's hand. She walked over to me. I want to be very clear that nobody expected this. Delphine reached for her and missed. Vesper's mouth actually opened. There was a sort of collective lurch through everybody standing on those steps. Princess Marin walked across 11 feet of wet stone in front of the world's press with her face a wreck, and she stopped in front of me and she looked up. I was locked at attention. I could not look down at her without breaking again, and I had already broken, and I found that I could not do it a second time. So I stared straight ahead over the top of her head, and I could feel her looking at me, and my eyes were burning, and I thought, very distinctly, do not you dare. Not in front of 40,000 people, not today." And Marin said, in a small clogged voice, in the middle of a state funeral, to a corporal she had never spoken to in her life, "I am sad." I did not answer her. I couldn't. She stood there for perhaps 2 seconds, and then she reached out and she put her hand flat against the front of my tunic, just laid it there, palm open, the way you'd touch a horse to let it know you're there, and she left it for a moment. 9 years old. And she said, "Thank you." Then her mother reached her and gathered her up and took her back. The coffin arrived at the foot of the steps. The organ started inside the cathedral. You could hear it come up through the ground, through the boots, this enormous low shudder, and the choreography took over because the choreography always does. The family fell in. They turned. They went up the steps behind Queen Ottoline. And I stood there. 4 hours and 20 minutes I'd stood, and I stood another 2 hours and 10 while they buried her, and I did not move, and I did not blink, and my hands were entirely dead by the end of it. I was arrested at 13:22 in the yard behind St. Aldwyn's before I had taken off my bearskin. 2 officers came for me, men I knew. Neither of them would look at me. One of them, Sergeant Major Hale, who had trained me at Harrogate, who had once made me stand in a corridor for 6 hours because my chin strap was a 1/4 inch loose, took my rifle from me and held it and stared at the ground. And he said very quietly, so the other man couldn't hear, "Was it true what she said?" I said yes. And Sergeant Major Hale, 26 years service, hardest man I ever met, a man who once told a room of 19-year-olds that a guardsman's feelings were a private matter to be dealt with on his own time, and preferably not at all. Sergeant Major Hale nodded once and closed his eyes and said, "Good." Then he arrested me. They put me in a room at Renwick Barracks with a table and 2 chairs and a window you couldn't see out of, and they left me there for 6 hours before anybody came. That's a technique. I want you to know that I knew it was a technique. I'd been on the other side of it, not often, but once or twice, standing outside a door while some poor lad sweated himself sick in an empty room. You leave a man alone long enough and he starts prosecuting himself. Saves everybody a job. It works, by the way. By hour 4 I had built the entire case against myself, brick by brick, and it was airtight. You broke ranks at a state funeral. You spoke to the Queen Consort of Aldermere without being addressed. You did it 11 feet from the coffin of the woman your grandfather guarded. Whatever she said, you had one duty on that road, and it was to be a piece of furniture in a red coat, and you failed it in front of the entire world. I sat in that room, and I thought about Peveril's face over the top of the coffin. Elias, what have you done? And I thought, I've ended the Rooks. 3 generations, and I've ended it in 11 seconds. The first man through the door was a major named Creven, legal branch. He had a folder and a pen, and the sort of face that has never once been surprised by anything. He sat down, he didn't offer me tea, he opened the folder. He said, Corporal Rooke, tell me what you heard. So I told him, word for word, the same words I'd give the board 4 days later, the same words I gave the papers eventually, the same words I've given you. She's not even sad, she's performing. She's been coached, 9 years old and already a little actress. Ottoline would have been appalled, and then the laugh. Creven wrote none of it down. That's the detail that stayed with me. He sat there with a pen in his hand and a blank sheet in front of him, and he listened to the whole thing, and he wrote nothing. When I finished, he looked at me for a while. Then he said, you appreciate that the Queen Consort has given a rather different account. I said, I'd imagine she has, sir. She states that she remarked to Mrs. Ansell that the princess appeared unwell, that she expressed concern, that you misheard, became agitated and shouted. I didn't shout, sir. Somebody says you shouted. Then somebody's a liar, sir. There were 40,000 people 50 yards away and a coffin coming up the road. I'd not have raised my voice at that funeral if the building was on fire. Creven's face did nothing, but he put the pen down. He said there were 17 people within earshot, Corporal. Yes, sir. 16 of them have made statements saying they heard nothing at all. I want to talk about those 16 for a moment. Because I know who they were. I knew them then. 2 officers from my own line, 4 palace security men, 3 household staff, the master of the approach and his assistant, a photographer from the palace press office who was standing close enough to have his shoes ruined by the same puddle as me. And Peveril, my friend, my roommate for 8 months at Harrogate, who was carrying the near left corner of the Queen's coffin 10 feet away. 16 people said they heard nothing. I don't hate any of them. I want that understood. I've had 11 years to work out whether I hate them, and I've landed on no. Because I know exactly what happened in each of those 16 rooms. A man like Creven sat down opposite each of them with a blank folder and said, in a reasonable voice, "Did you hear anything?" And every single one of them thought about their mortgage, and their kids, and their pension, and the fact that Corporal Elias Rooke had already jumped off the cliff, and there was absolutely nothing to be gained by jumping after him. And they said no. I'd like to tell you I'd have done differently. I've thought about it for 11 years, and I honestly don't know. That's the truth, I don't know. Creven closed the folder. He said, 16 out of 17, Corporal. That's what you're standing in front of. And I said, and this was the only moment in 4 days where I nearly came apart. Sir, who's the 17th? Creven stood up. He picked up his pen, he tucked the folder under his arm, he went to the door. And he said, without turning round, "There's nobody in that room who can help you, Corporal. Get some sleep." He didn't say there is no 17th. He said there's nobody in that room who can help you. I lay awake all night on that camp bed doing arithmetic on the difference. Day 2 was worse than day 1, because day 2 was when the papers got it. Not the truth. The truth took considerably longer. What the papers got on day 2 was a leak. A very tidy, very well-shaped leak, of the sort that does not happen by accident, and the shape of it was this. Guardsman's breakdown, AT State funeral. That was the frame. Not guardsman speaks, not guardsman accuses. Breakdown, a man under strain, a man who'd stood 4 hours in the cold. Exhaustion, they said, possibly something more. There was a very carefully worded paragraph about the pressures of ceremonial duty and the toll it takes, and how the palace's thoughts were with Corporal Rooke and his family at what must be a difficult time. They didn't call me a liar. They called me unwell. That's cleverer, you see. You can't fight unwell. If you shout, you're proving it. If you're calm, you're managing it. There's no move on that board. My mother rang the barracks 11 times that day, and they wouldn't put her through. They found her, of course. The press. Kelsbridge is not a large place, and Rooke is not a common name. 2 of them on the step by lunchtime, 1 at the back gate. Somebody photographed my grandfather's allotment, the actual allotment, the greenhouse with the cracked pane, the rhubarb bed. I don't know how they knew. I never told anybody about the allotment. I'd never told anybody. And they ran it under the headline "Where the Guardsman Goes." My mother, who is 74 and has never raised her voice in her life, stood on her own doorstep and told a reporter from the Aldermere Standard to get off her step or she'd have his shoes. He printed that too, made her sound mad. Day 3. Day 3 is when it happened. They brought me into the room at 8:30 in the morning, and Creven was there, and 2 officers I didn't know, and a woman from the palace in a gray suit who never gave her name and never spoke once. And they told me the board would convene the following morning and that they'd be recommending discharge. Not dishonorable, they were at pains about that, very generous of them, but discharge. Medical. On the grounds of the stress-related episode I had suffered on the 9th of November. They had a form, they wanted me to sign it. If I signed it, I'd keep the pension. Reduced, but a pension. If I didn't sign it, the board would proceed to the full charge, and the full charge was gross insubordination in the presence of the sovereign, and the full charge carried no pension at all. Sign the paper saying you were mad, and you eat. Don't sign it and you're right and you starve. I sat there for a long time. I thought about my mother on her step with the shoes. I thought about 11 years and my father's 19 and my grandfather's black fingers. I thought about the fact that I was 34 with no trade, no education past 16, and a reference from the household guard that was about to become the single worst thing on any application I ever filled in. And I thought about a 9-year-old girl with her hand flat on my tunic saying I am sad. I reached for the pen. I want you to know that. I reached for it. I got my hand on it. And that's when there was a knock on the door. Mrs. Ansell. She was God. She was 50-odd, small, very neat, the sort of woman who has spent 30 years being extremely good at a job that requires nobody to notice her. Private secretary to the Queen Consort, 11 years in the post. She came into that room holding a piece of paper with both hands, and she was shaking so badly that the paper was making a noise. Creven stood up. He said, "Mrs. Ansell, this is a closed." And she said, "I've written a statement." She put it on the table. And then, because she'd clearly rehearsed this in front of a mirror at 3 in the morning, and knew she had exactly 1 run at it before her nerve went, she said the whole thing out loud, very fast, to the middle distance, with her hands locked together in front of her. On the 9th of November at approximately 5 minutes past 11 at the north approach of St. Aldwyn's Cathedral, Her Majesty the Queen Consort said to me, and I quote, "She's not even sad, she's performing, she's been coached, look at her, she's timing it for the cameras, 9 years old and already a little actress." Ottoline would have been appalled. Her Majesty then laughed. Corporal Rooke's account is accurate in every particular. He did not shout. He said, and I quote, "Ma'am, she's 9. She stopped. She was white as the paper. Then she said, in a completely different voice, small and wrecked, and not rehearsed at all, "I have said nothing for 3 days, and I have not slept for 3 days, and I would like it to be written down somewhere that when it happened I made a sound, and I did not make a word, and there was a man standing 11 feet away who was not even permitted to breathe, and he found one." The room did not move. Mrs. Ansell picked up her handbag. She looked at me properly, straight on, for about a second and a half. And she said, "I'm sorry it took me 3 days, Corporal." And she walked out. I have never seen her again. She resigned that afternoon. She's never spoken to a journalist, never written a book, never given an interview. And when the whole thing broke open a fortnight later and every paper in Aldermere was trying to find her, she had gone to a sister in the West and shut the door. She was 62 when she died 4 years ago. I sent flowers. I didn't sign the card because I didn't know what to write and because I thought she'd have preferred it that way. She was the 17th person. The board convened the next morning, and it lasted 40 minutes. I was not discharged. I was formally reprimanded for breaking ranks, which was correct, and which I accepted then and accept now because I did break ranks, and the fact that I'd break them again tomorrow doesn't make it not a breach, and I was returned to duty. Nobody apologized to me. Nobody has ever apologized to me. The palace issued a statement 11 days later, in the flattest language ever committed to paper, noting that remarks made in a moment of considerable personal distress had been the subject of misunderstanding, and that Her Majesty deeply regrets any hurt caused. Any hurt caused to a 9-year-old. At her grandmother's funeral. Queen Consort Vesper withdrew from public duties 4 months later. Health reasons. She has not been seen at a state occasion since. I have never spoken about her again, and I'm not going to start now. She has to live inside her own head. I imagine that's a considerable sentence. I did not last long back in the guard. That's not bitterness, that's just how it went. I was returned to duty and I stood my posts and I did my job, and I did it well and it was over. Because you cannot be scenery, once 40,000 people know your name. I'd stand at Vantry Gate and the tourists wouldn't photograph the guardsman. They'd photograph him. There'd be a little ripple down the pavement, that's the one who spoke, and children would wave, and people would say thank you through the railings, and it was very kind and it was very warm and it made me completely useless. The whole point of me was that I was nobody. I'd gone and become somebody. I put my papers in the following autumn, 12 years, 1 month. Sergeant Major Hale shook my hand at the gate and said, "You were the best I trained." And then he said, "And you were the worst guardsman I ever had." And both of those things were true, and he knew it, and so did I. I do the allotment now. That's not a joke. My grandfather's plot in Kelsbridge, the one they photographed, the one with the cracked pane. I took it over when my mother could no longer manage it. I fixed the greenhouse. The rhubarbs come back. I go there most mornings. It's very quiet. Sometimes a stranger will stop at the fence and say, "Are you him?" And I say yes, and they always want to talk about bravery. And I always tell them the same thing, which is that it wasn't bravery, because bravery is a decision, and I didn't make one. I just heard something I couldn't unhear. That's not courage, that's just being unable to look away. The letter came 8 weeks after the funeral. It arrived at my mother's house in Kelsbridge, because that was the address in my file, and my mother rang me and said in a very odd voice that there was something for me and that I should come. It was a small envelope, cheap, the sort you'd buy in a supermarket. Hand-addressed, in a hand I did not recognize. Big, round, careful letters, slightly wobbly, the kind of handwriting where somebody has clearly ruled a faint pencil line underneath and then rubbed it out afterwards. Inside was a single sheet, torn out of a school exercise book. You could still see the ragged edge where it had been pulled from the staples. It said, "Dear Corporal Rooke, I am not supposed to write to you, and I am writing to you anyway. Grandmama used to say that the guards outside are not statues, they are people, and that I should never forget it, and I am afraid I did forget it until you spoke. I am sorry that you got in trouble. I told them it was not fair, and they said I was too young to understand, and I said I understood it perfectly well. I am 9. Thank you for saying so. Marin." That's it, that's the whole letter. There's a postscript. Underneath, squeezed in at the bottom in smaller writing, like she'd thought of it after and couldn't fit it properly. P.S. Her name was Bramble, the dog on the lawn. You said I chased a dog. Her name was Bramble and she is very old now, but she still tries. I keep it in the greenhouse. Not in a frame, not under glass, nothing like that, folded up in a tobacco tin on the shelf above the seed trays, with a rubber band round it, next to a packet of runner beans. It's gone soft at the folds. The ink's faded a bit on the top line. I get it out sometimes. Not often. 2 or 3 times a year when the rhubarb's coming and it's quiet and I've got the whole morning. And I stand there in my grandfather's greenhouse with a piece of a 9-year-old's exercise book in my hands, and I think about 11 feet of wet stone, and 11 seconds of sound, and 11 years of standing perfectly still. People ask me if I'd do it again. They always want me to say yes. You can see it on them. They want the line. They want the guardsman to square his shoulders and say every time without hesitation, and they'll go home happy. And I'm sorry, but that's not the truth, and I've told enough polite lies for one lifetime. The truth is I don't know. I lost my career. I lost my anonymity, which I have never got back and never will. My mother spent a fortnight with reporters on her step. 16 men I served with had to decide, in a small room, whether to save themselves or save me, and they chose themselves, and I've had to carry the knowledge that they were probably right to. I don't know if I'd do it again. But I know this. That child stood in the cold for 4.5 hours with her heart broken, being as good as she knew how to be, in front of the entire world, and somebody laughed at her. And there were 17 of us close enough to hear it. And one of us said something. That's all it was in the end. Not bravery, not protocol or the breaking of it or any of the grand things they've written since. Just one person, in a very quiet street, refusing to pretend they hadn't heard. I'd like to think that's the smallest thing a man can do. I'm not sure it is.